Ever get that feeling? There's this whole hidden machinery behind every choice we make. Like, what really drives us? That's the kind of stuff that I don't know about you, but it keeps me up at night. And I think today we're going right into the heart of it. Like, what shapes our behavior and decisions at the most fundamental level?
It's the tussle, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
the timeless one.
Mm.
What makes us us? And it really does bring together some of the biggest questions out there. Free will, how that connects to when we hold people responsible for their actions, and the real story behind, like, our nature versus how we're shaped by our experiences,
Hmm.
especially when we look at something as serious and complex as violence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And we've got a fascinating kind of collection of thoughts here. Some personal reflections I jotted down last March, actually, 26, I think it was, plus a bunch of research we've been looking into. And our goal in this deep dive is to really try to get a handle on all these different ideas about free will, about moral responsibility, and then we'll explore how both our innate characteristics in the world around us, how those things mold us. And hopefully by the time we're done here, we'll give you a much clearer, more insightful take on these topics that I think a lot of people find confusing. So, with all that said, where do we even begin to untangle this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with this idea of moral responsibility. What does it actually mean? Like when we say someone is morally responsible for something they've done.
Okay, moral responsibility. It feels like, I don't know, who deserves a thumbs up or,
Yeah.
a side eye for something they've done.
Yeah.
But how does that connect with whether we actually have a real say in our actions, like this whole free will thing?
That's exactly it. It's really about, at its core, holding individuals accountable for their actions.
Hmm.
And the really fascinating thing is how these different ways of thinking about free will directly impact how we actually define moral responsibility. Like they're kind of inextricably linked.
So there isn't just one definition of being responsible, basically.
It's not that simple. Right.
That makes sense. Walk me through some of these viewpoints, these different viewpoints.
Let's start with libertarianism. This perspective basically argues that in order for you to be truly morally responsible for an action, you must have what they call libertarian free will.
Yeah.
So this genuine ability to have chosen a different path in that very moment.
So picture this. I'm at a party and I say something really clumsy, right?
Hmm.
A libertarian would argue that I'm only truly responsible for that awkward comment and maybe deserve, I don't know, a cringe moment or two, only if I genuinely could have chosen different words right before they left my mouth.
You got it. For a libertarian, moral responsibility is completely tied to your intention and that real capacity to have avoided doing what you did. They say praise or blame are only justified when you have that control over your choices, that authentic control. The key takeaway here is genuine alternative possibilities.
Got it. It does feel kind of intuitive, right? But then you've got compatibilism, or what's sometimes called soft determinism. How do they see this connection between free will and responsibility?
Well, compatibilists have a different way of looking at it. They would argue that free will doesn't necessarily have to be in conflict with determinism. That idea that, everything that happens is caused by what came before. So their definition of free will basically centers on your actions stemming from what they call internal causes, things like your desires, your intentions, your beliefs.
So even if my intense urge for a double cheeseburger was in some cosmic way predetermined, a compatibilist might still say I'm responsible for ordering it because it ultimately stemmed from, I don't know, my internal desire and my hunger.
Exactly. They attribute moral responsibility to actions that are driven by these internal motivations, even if those motivations themselves might be part of this larger chain of determined events. Now, a really important point here, and one where they clash with libertarians a lot, is that compatibilists don't believe you necessarily had to have a genuine alternative in that moment to be responsible. As their sources point out, critics would say, this doesn't really capture that sense of real choice that the libertarians emphasize.
Right. It's almost like saying you're free as long as you're doing what you internally want to do, even if those wants were set in motion years ago, right? Right. Okay, so what about the folks who think that free will and determinism are just fundamentally like oil and water? They just don't mix.
Right. So that would be the position of incompatibilism.
Yeah.
And within that, specifically, hard determinism. They basically say free will and determinism can't exist together. If every action is already set by prior causes, then the idea that we could have acted differently is kind of an illusion our brains create.
So under hard determinism, that time I, accidentally bumped into someone on the street, it wasn't really an accident in the sense that I could have avoided it. It was just the inevitable outcome of a whole bunch of physical events.
That's the line of thinking, yeah. And if that's true, hard determinists would say that moral responsibility, as we normally think about it with blame and praise and all that, doesn't really make sense either.
Hmm.
Because individuals couldn't have genuinely acted otherwise. And this is why they, a lot of them, question the very basis of, like, our justice system and punishment and condemning people morally. The key insight here is that no one is ever truly blameworthy if this idea of determinism is true.
That is a mind-bending view. It almost feels like, I don't know, it absolves everyone of responsibility in a way. But you
Mhm.
mentioned a skeptical perspective, which sounds like it sits somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, and some philosophers, and one notable one is John Martin Fisher, offer a kind of skeptical view. They propose this idea that maybe moral responsibility doesn't actually require full-blown libertarian free will. They say that maybe a weaker form of control is actually enough for us to be considered morally responsible.
A weaker form of control. So what might that look like? Can you give me a real-world example?
So think of it this way. Even if your initial desire for something was influenced by factors beyond your control, right? You might still have the ability to recognize reasons why acting on that desire is wrong and then choose not to act on it. So this weaker form of control is really focusing on your capacity to kind of guide your behavior in response to reasons and values, even if the source of your desire might not be completely free in that libertarian sense. So it shifts a bit from, could you have done otherwise, to more of, is it appropriate to hold you accountable and apply consequences, like a reward for a good deed or penalty for a bad one? So even if the urge to, let's say, take credit for a colleague's idea was super strong and maybe had like determined roots, your ability to understand why that's wrong and not do it might be enough for the skeptic to say, you're still morally responsible for that action.
Interesting. It's less about like having a completely open range of choices in the past and more about your ability to respond to reasons right now in the present, to think things through.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to bridge this gap between determinism and how we experience accountability every day. So I think the big takeaway from all this is that how you even define moral responsibility is really tied to your beliefs about free will. They're not separate questions. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And this has implications for everything, from how we give compliments to how we punish people. Huge implications.
Okay, so we've navigated these sort of major viewpoints on free will and responsibility. Let's zoom in on what makes an action free, regardless of which of those like bigger camps you might fall into. What are the like generally accepted ingredients for a free action? What do we usually look for?
Right. So even if philosophers disagree on the actual nature of free will, there's some common elements that most people would point to when they describe a freely chosen action. Think of them as those like baseline criteria.
Okay, lay them on me. What are those fundamental conditions?
So the first one we already talked about a little, the ability to do otherwise. It's the idea that for an action to be free, you genuinely had other options available to you in that situation. You weren't forced into it. You had more than one real choice.
Right, makes sense. If someone held my hand and made me push a button, it wouldn't really feel like my free action. Right. What's the next ingredient?
Number two is control over one's choices. This basically emphasizes that you are the author of your own decisions. It has to come from your will, your intentions, not from some external pressure or manipulation. You're the one in the driver's seat.
So no hidden puppet master pulling the strings, controlling my desires and decisions.
Exactly. And the third really commonly cited one is responsiveness to reasons. This suggests that your choices aren't just random. They're motivated by your desires, values, beliefs, your intentions. If someone asks, why did you do that? You should be able to actually explain your reasons.
So it's not just about having multiple paths in front of me and me picking one, but also the path I choose is based on my own thinking, my own motivations.
Precisely. And when we talk about free will in general, beyond the specific philosophies, this idea of being able to make choices that aren't like predetermined by some outside force or event, that's really what we're talking about, as our research shows. It's that sense of agency, like we're in control of our actions, we shape our own lives. And as we said, it's closely tied to this idea of holding people morally responsible.
Right. But this is where the tension with determinism keeps coming up, right? That maybe this whole experience of free will with these conditions is just a really convincing illusion our brains cook up because ultimately everything is just caused by something else.
Yeah, that is the fundamental conflict, absolutely. But regardless of how that debate shakes out, these three conditions give us a good way to understand what we generally mean when we talk about an act of free will in everyday life.
Okay, so we've tackled free will, responsibility, and these conditions for a free action. Now, I want to shift to something that feels a little bit more, I don't know, grounded, something more concrete. The actual forces that shape us into who we are and really influence our behavior. Let's dig into the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Oh, this is a classic debate, right?
Yeah.
It's been central to how we understand human behavior for, centuries. And I think for a while it was really framed as this either question,
Mm.
nature or nurture. But thankfully, I think our understanding has gotten a lot more nuanced now. We recognize that they're not opposed. They're actually deeply intertwined, and they interact all the time and influence each other in these super complex ways that, frankly, we're still figuring out. It's not a competition. It's more of a collaboration.
So it's not about which one wins, it's more about how they work together to create us.
Exactly. And when we talk about nature, we're talking about those biological things we inherit, our genes, our predispositions, those biological building blocks that make us who we are from a physical standpoint. For example, if we're thinking about aggression, there might be evolutionary pressures that have shaped some of our basic biological tendencies related to it,
Mm.
and that would fall under nature.
So some of us might have a genetic, inclination to be a little more easily, I don't know, agitated or something.
That's a possibility, right? It's something to consider. But nurture is the other crucial half of this whole thing. This includes all the environmental factors that shape us, like how we're raised by our families, the social messages we get from our communities, from our cultures, our education, all the events and interactions we have throughout our lives. These external forces play a huge role in how those inherent capacities, those natural predispositions, actually show up in our behavior.
So I might have a genetic tendency towards, I don't know, high energy levels, that would be nature. But whether that turns into, me being a hyperactive kid or a super driven entrepreneur or someone who just needs to run a marathon every weekend, that's nurture, right? It depends on how I was raised, the opportunities and constraints in my environment.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. What our research really emphasizes is that while those genetic foundations might be there, it's really the environment that has the final say in how our behavior actually unfolds. And that's especially true when we're talking about really complex stuff like violence. Just because there might be some evolutionary basis for something doesn't mean it's inevitable or that it will look the same for everyone.
Which kind of brings us to that thankfully largely debunked idea that someone is just born evil, right?
Absolutely. That whole notion that someone is just inherently evil from birth, it just doesn't fit with how we understand this nature and nurture interplay. Humans are born with the potential for a ton of behaviors, both good and bad. And how those potentials actually develop is incredibly influenced by the world around them. It's that constant conversation between our biology and our environment that makes us who we are.
Earlier, you talked about how evolutionary factors might provide a sort of basic groundwork for something like aggression, but then psychological and societal factors, a lot of that influenced by nurture, determine how it actually plays out. Can you give me a more concrete example of that interaction, like how it works in real life?
Sure. Think about it like this. Evolution might have given us that basic fight or flight response, that natural reaction to a threat. That's part of our biology, our nature. Now, whether that response actually turns into physical aggression in any given situation is hugely influenced by nurture, by things like how we were taught to deal with conflict as kids, the social norms about violence in our community, legal consequences for being aggressive. A kid raised in a culture that really values peaceful negotiation and has strong rules against violence is way less likely to be physically aggressive than a kid raised in an environment where violence is normal or even, glorified.
Yeah.
The underlying biological mechanism might be the same, but how it comes out is totally different because of nurture.
So it's like a constant feedback loop. Our genes give us these starting points, and then our experiences, our environment shape and mold how those starting points actually turn into, real world behavior.
Yeah.
It's definitely more complicated than just nature versus nurture. Like they're separate things.
Exactly. It's dynamic, it's reciprocal, and that relationship is what drives all the diversity we see in how humans behave. It's not one being more important than the other. It's about understanding how they're always interacting.
Okay, so we've explored free will, responsibility, and the basics of nature and nurture. Now I want to zoom in on a really complex and frankly disturbing part of human behavior, violence. How do all these pieces we've talked about come together when we're trying to understand why humans can be so violent?
Violence is really where all these threads come together, right?
Yeah.
And everything we've been looking at points to this idea that human violence isn't caused by just one thing. It comes from this super complex mix of evolutionary things, psychological development, which is shaped by both nature and nurture, and a whole bunch of societal influences. It's multi-layered, for sure.
Let's unpack those layers then. Starting with the evolutionary perspective, how has our evolutionary history shaped our capacity for violence? Like, where does that come from?
Well, unfortunately, from an evolutionary perspective, aggression probably was an adaptive strategy in certain environments a long time ago. Think about the challenges early humans had: competing for food and territory, defending themselves and their group, even establishing those social hierarchies. In those situations, being aggressive might have actually helped them survive and reproduce.
So, in those tough early environments, being aggressive could have given you an advantage in terms of survival and passing on your genes. It makes sense in a kind of disturbing way.
Yeah, it's not the most comforting thought, but it's important to consider. Our research points to a few different types of aggression that might have these evolutionary roots. There's proactive aggression, often seen in those, like conflicts between groups, one group attacking another to get resources, something we see in other primates like chimps. And then there's reactive aggression, which is more of a defensive response when you feel threatened. Social evolution theory also suggests that aggression could have been a factor in, getting access to resources and even competing for mates.
Okay, it's kind of a scary thought. But we're not just like puppets to these ancient instincts. What about our capacity to not be violent?
That's a really crucial point. Humans have also evolved this incredible evolutionary flexibility, I think you could call it. We have these higher level cognitive abilities like rational thought, empathy, and being able to develop and follow complex social rules. These are things that make us unique, and they allow us to potentially override those more primal aggressive tendencies with reason, understanding, and just social structures. So evolution might have given us that basic groundwork, but it's culture and society that really shape how and if that aggression shows up.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's the evolutionary backdrop. Now, how do psychological factors fit in when we're talking about violence? How does that layer work?
Well, psychological factors are where we see nature and nurture really dancing together. It gets intricate. Our primal instincts, those things we talked about that have those evolutionary roots, get totally intertwined with all the social learning and conditioning we go through in our lives. And as we've been saying, while our genes might give us certain predispositions, certain tendencies, it's our environment, our upbringing, our social interactions, whether we're exposed to violence or not, all that stuff shapes how those tendencies actually play out in our behavior. So it's this constant interaction that really forms our psychology. And I think it reinforces that humans aren't born good or evil, right? We have the capacity for a huge range of behaviors, and our psychological development, influenced by nature and nurture, is what guides us along that spectrum. Plus, we can't forget about our own conscious reasoning, our desires, our values in making choices about whether or not to be violent.
Right. So even if I have, I don't know, a quick flash of anger or an aggressive impulse, that might be rooted in some ancient part of my brain, but my conscious thought, my learned empathy, my moral compass, all that can still step in and say, whoa, hold on, this isn't the way to go.
Exactly. Now, the next piece to consider here, and I think a really important one, especially when we look at how rates of violence vary so much in different places, is the role of societal factors.
Yeah, that seems huge. You see such different levels of violence in different societies. It's striking.
It really is. And societal factors exert a ton of influence on violent behavior. Social conditioning, the norms and values that are dominant, all the environmental things we've been talking about, they're key. Cultural institutions like our legal systems, education systems, even how the media portrays violence, along with just informal social norms about what's acceptable and what's not. All of that can either promote or restrain aggression, either accidentally or on purpose. The context people live in, the social structures, the values of that society, all of that plays a role in shaping when and how violence happens.
So basically, a society that values cooperation, emphasizes peaceful ways to resolve conflicts, and has strong consequences for violence, they're likely to see a lot less of it compared to a society where aggression is, I don't know, maybe celebrated or where there aren't good ways to deal with conflict.
That's the general idea, yeah. It's all about the messages people get from their environment, the behaviors they see around them, and what they think the consequences will be if they act violently. Social norms can be incredibly powerful in shaping how people act.
It seems like when we're trying to understand why humans are violent, it's definitely not about pointing to just one thing. It's this whole web of our evolutionary past, our individual psychology, which is shaped by both our genes and our experiences and the societies we live in. It sounds like evolution might give us this basic set of tools, but psychology and society are really what determine how and when we use them.
That's a really good way to put it. It's true. I mean, the underlying capacity for things like aggression, that might be rooted in our evolutionary history, but it's those psychological processes that we've been talking about, shaped by that constant interaction with our environment and the huge influence of social norms, all of that dictates how violence is expressed in all its different forms.
This has been a true deep dive into some really, really big questions about, what makes us tick? So let's try to bring some of these key ideas together for you listening. We've explored those philosophical stances on free will and how they directly impact how we see moral responsibility, right? We looked at those like
Right.
core conditions that people often say are part of a free action. And then we dug into that dynamic interplay between nature and nurture, how they shape behavior. And finally, we looked at how all these things come together when we're trying to understand something as complex and as troubling as human violence.
Yeah, and what really comes out of this is just how intricate this whole thing is. Understanding human agency, human behavior, there's so much to consider, and there are no easy answers. It's fascinating and complex.
It really gives you a lot to think about. I
Yeah.
mean, given all these different ways to look at free will and this complex web of biology and environment that shapes us, how should we as a society even approach these ideas of justice, responsibility, and how we try to prevent harmful behaviors? It's definitely not as simple as saying, someone made a totally free choice or they were just born that way.
Definitely not. And it makes us ask some pretty big questions about how we build our legal systems, how we figure out who's accountable, and how we even create programs to help people change and make communities safer.
Hmm?
It really challenges some of our most basic ideas about human nature.
Yeah, it's a lot of food for thought for sure.
Yeah.
It might even make you rethink some of your own reactions to why people do the things they do, which is always a good thing.
And hopefully it encourages everyone listening to keep exploring these topics, these big questions. Maybe think about which perspective on free will really resonates with you, how you understand what it means to be human and make choices in the world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's definitely given us a lot to think about.